I'd like to introduce to you Laurel Trevino Murphy. She's the outreach coordinator for UT's JA Lab in the College of Natural Sciences, the University of Texas at Austin. She has a bachelor's in biology from the National University of Mexico and master's degree in botany and wildland resource sciences from the University of California at Berkeley, where she focused on ethnobotany, agroforestry, and natural resource sociology. Prior to practicing environmental education at the Wildflower Center, she had taught biology and ecology at the secondary and college levels and developed biology and natural science curricula. In the JA Lab, Laurel has built a public engagement program around native pollinator conservation, in which she has produced educational resources on native bees and plants and collaborated with biologists and land managers on pollinator habit conservation initiatives. Laurel's hobbies are gardening, managing native plants on hill country land, I know what that's like, and doing botanical illustration and observing wildlife in person and on camera. Please welcome Laura Trevino Murphy.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me to speak about native bees, plants, and habitats. I'll be covering pollination mutualisms, ecosystem functions, bee diversity, bee life history, and habitat conservation. Should I start over? I will be covering pollination mutualisms, ecosystem functions, diversity, bee life history, and conservation. But first, so how does this advance? This one. But first, let me pronounce my version of the University of Texas land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that we're meeting on indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for North America, where Lipan, Mescalero, and Kiowa Apache, Caddo, Carrizo, Comecrudo, Coahuilteca, Comanche, Kickapoo, Tonkawa, Isleta del Sur, Pueblo, and all Native American and indigenous people and communities have been part of the lands and territories of Texas. I am grateful for their legacy. I'm grateful for their legacy of native plants and crops that sustain native pollinators and humans alike. First, let's talk about and agree on what is introduced, naturalized, and native. Native species originated and evolved in a given geographic area and are adapted to local environments. And that has a geographic scale component. American continent, North American region, Edwards Plateau ecoregion, or a hill country habitat. Apis honeybees are native to the Old World and were introduced and naturalized across the American continent since the 1600s. Green sweat bees, Acapostemon texanus, as you can guess, is native to Texas. Now, most of native pollinators in this photo are insects. In fact, most global pollinators are insects, and most flower visiting insects are incidental pollinators that visit flowers to drink nectar. Pollination. Pollination facilitates sexual reproduction in vascular plants, and sex increases genetic variation among seeds and plants. About 50% of plants self-pollinate. So in selfers, pollen from the anthers of one stigma attaches to the from the anthers of one flower attached to the stigma of the same flower. But about 75% of plants are outcrossers who need cross-pollination in varying degrees to reproduce sexually. In cross-pollination, pollen travels from the anthers of one plant to the stigma of another. Pollinators mediate pollination in outcrossers especially, but not exclusively. Cross-pollination produces more genetic variation by shuffling 2 decks of cards instead of 1, if you will. Now, cross-pollination improves fruit quality. This on the right is a commercial apple, but not very different from our Blanco crab apple. In this cut apple, there are 2 seeds per compartment, which means that flower was cross-pollinated. Incomplete pollination produces small lopsided fruit with fewer seeds, if any seeds at all. Large round crab apples result from honeybees, large carpenter bees, bumblebees pollinating flowers. So cross-pollination improves fruit quality. This is a cultivated strawberry, but we have our native Fragaria virginiana. Now, I want a raise of hands here. Which one do you think came from a pollinated flower? Was it the one on the left? Cross-pollination improves fruit yield too. Dr. Sarah Cusser studied pollination ecology in Texas peaches and cotton, and she found that several native insects, including our native longhorn bees, pollinate native cotton. Cross-pollination increased average boll weight by about 17%, and that represented close to $100 per acre, with regional gains of $1 million. So cross-pollination improves fruit quality and fruit yield. During the pandemic, these little black and white striped bees zipped around my bean plants, and I would like you to deduce which one of these pods developed from a bee pollinated flower. Raise your hand if you think it was the pod on the right. Right you are. Plump fall pods had 3 to 4 large seeds, and shriveled summer pods had 2 to 3 small seeds. Little black and white striped bees are in the Megachilidae family. They pollinate legumes typically, and they loved my bean plants. In fact, a study of 41 global crops concluded that fruit set increases with wild pollinator visitation. The next few slides, I'll talk about bee plant mutualisms. Bees only eat pollen, nectar, and some eat oils. Pollen provides protein, nectar provides carbs, minerals, and water. Now, some plants either produce pollen or nectar, so bees must visit many plants. And bees are not picky about their nectar, but they do have a pollen predilection because they feed it to their brood. Polylectic bees we call generalists, and they gather pollen from various plant genera and families. Oligolectic bees are specialists. They gather from few plant groups. And monolectic bees specialize on one genus or even one species. Now, native bees prefer foraging on native plants. And this is true for foraging around farms too. So why are bees such effective pollinators? Well, mutualisms. For 3 basic reasons: their diet, their form, and their behavior. Most bees rely solely on nectar and pollen for food. Some eat other stuff. And they carry pollen on loads on their hair. Females actively collect pollen for their brood, and they manipulate flowers to access the rewards. They also exhibit floral fidelity, visiting the same species on one trip. And this foraging constancy ensures cross-pollination in plants. More mutualisms. Bees have feather-branched hair called plumose. Basically, they have split ends. And those get positively charged when they move their wings very fast on flying. Now, spiky pollen is negatively charged. And since opposites attract, static happens. And pollen clings to the hair with electrostatic forces. Now, bee pollen plants produce large, nutritious, spiky pollen. More mutualisms. Most bees have hair brushes called scopa, and some bees have hair baskets called corbicula. Scopate bees have brushes on their hind legs like the sweat bee above, or on their underbelly like leafcutters. Corbiculate bees like honeybees, bumblebees, carpenters tuck moist pollen pellets in their hind leg baskets. Most bees carry dry pollen loads, which is prevalent in flowering plants. So I ask you, where do hairless bees carry their pollen? More mutualisms. Plants offer bees attractants, rewards, and tricks. Attractants are colors and aromas, and rewards are pollen, nectar, and oils, food. And bees have large compound eyes that see in the visible light and in the ultraviolet, so they can see nectar guides on petals. They also have antennae, which are actually their noses. So this longhorned bee, that's me in technology, by the way. We don't meet eye to eye.
Check some connections here.
Maybe we need to load. You just fix it.
It'll say
Is that
A
what
and
changed
MB.
it? So that bee has really long noses. You think that's what it was? Now, plants reserve their tricks specifically for bees. Pollinia. Milkweeds and orchids have pollinia, which are pollen-laden saddlebags that hitch rides on bees' toes when bees step in it. Plant pollinator networks. Wildflowers are pollinated by various insects. Native bees are the most important pollinators of flowering plants in the wild. Generalists pollinate many species and specialists prefer few. Plant pollinator networks describe the interactions between these communities of plants and pollinators. And PPNs, plant pollinator networks, are seasonal. So spring bees coincide with spring blooms. Some of these mutualisms go back as far as pollination, 75 million years ago. The Jaw Lab, researchers have confirmed that Texan bees like their native bees as much as Californians like their natives. Is that everything okay?
Yeah.
A diversity of seasonal blooms on hill country trees, shrubs, vines, and forbs provide pollinators with resources. About 4,000 out of 5,000 native Texas plant species are pollinated partly by 1,000 bee species. Imagine that 4 out of 5 seeds in a wildflower seed packet were pollinated by native bees. Lepidopteran, like monarch butterflies, tropics. Coleopteran beetles pollinate prickly pear cactus and rain lilies in our subtropical Texas. Dipterans, like syrphid flies, house flies, are important pollinators in temperate regions. I bet you didn't know that your carrots are fly pollinated. And in the tropics, cacao is thrip pollinated. Hymenopteran, flower wasps, pollinate wildflowers, while Mexican honey wasps pollinate avocados. Pollinator communities function as keystone species, which other species in ecosystems depend on for food. They perform essential ecosystem functions for animals and plant species. About 90% of the 300,000 global plant species are angiosperms. About 87% of angiosperms rely on 200,000 pollinator species throughout the world to produce fruits and seeds. In food webs, insect pollinators produce food for herbivores. Fruits and seeds make up about a fourth of bird diets and most of mammal diets. While pollinators disperse pollen, animals, like birds, disperse seeds. And both of those dispersal mechanisms regenerate plant populations, like this native mockingbird that will be dispersing Capsicum annuum, or Chile piquin, soon. So you see, it is all about the birds and the bees. In food webs, insect pollinators are food for carnivores. Mammal, reptile, amphibian diets rely on insects. About 90% of bird diets depend on insects at some stage of their life cycle. Here we see a robber fly and a spider eating honeybees. Sorry, somebody's got to eat them. And below we see a praying mantis eating a tiny dark bee. And these chicks are waiting for pollinator larvae. In food webs, insect pollinators also produce food for humans in agroecosystems. About three-fourths of global food crops rely to varying degrees on animal pollinators, and about half of those are bees. 70 out of 100 bee pollinated crops provide about 90% of the world's food. Bees are the most important agricultural pollinators. Just in US and Canada, there's about 100 crops that depend to varying degrees on animal pollination to set fruit and seed. And about 15% of native bees living around US crops, farms, and orchards augment honeybee pollination, contributing up to $20 billion a year in crop production. So pollination is an essential agroecosystem function. Just in Texas agroecosystems, bee pollinated crops include major horticultural and agronomic cash crops. For example, fruits include peaches and strawberries that are moderately dependent on pollination. Veggies could include tomatoes and chiles that have low to moderate dependence, and squashes, cucumbers, melons, and especially watermelons have a high dependence on pollination. Agronomic crops include alfalfa and cotton. Globally, pollination is essential to produce food, fodder, and fiber. Native bees also pollinate native crops. They can't tell the difference between wildflowers and crops, as is the case in the three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, the Native America milpa system. In this agroecosystem that was designed by Native American people eons ago, maize is wind pollinated, but beans and squash are bee pollinated. In this triad, the corn stalk grows first as a pole for beans to wrap up on, and squash grows last to shade out weeds. The three root systems also complement each other below ground. So bean nodules provide nitrogen. Sparse squash roots allow female squash bees to nest under the plants and forage at dawn. And the males snooze in the flowers. Milpas do provide humans and native pollinators good diets. In the diverse milpa agroecosystem, the complementary amino acids of corn and beans forms a complete protein, while tomatoes, chiles, quelites, which are pot herbs, provide vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, and so on. Leafcutters pollinate Fabaceae plants, squash bees pollinate Cucurbitaceae, bumblebees pollinate Solanaceae, and Mexican honeybees pollinate avocados. So milpas provide humans and native pollinators with good diets. So why are native bees good native crop pollinators? behavior. These big-eyed crepuscular bees, meaning dawn or dusk bees, exist in 4 different families. Bobs, that's an affectionate term for blue orchard bees or mason bees, although since we're in Texas, I'm going to call her Babette. Babette drums pollen from ericaceous blueberry anthers to spill it onto her underbelly. Now, she rises early, retires late, and works much broader ranges of light and temperature than honeybees do. Minor bees, or digger bees, like this Andrena in the Andrenidae, buzz pollinate ericaceous cranberry flowers, and bumblebees buzz pollinate solanaceae flowers. Now, honeybees cannot sonicate blueberries, cranberries, or tomatoes fused anthers. And they don't pollinate alfalfa well either. They don't like the keels swatting them, while native leafcutter bees don't mind that at all. Bees are flower lovers, Anthophila. They are grouped in the order Hymenoptera. Members of Hymenoptera are called because of the membranous wings, the see-through wings. The order Hymenoptera includes wasps and ants. Bees split from ancestral wasps as they became vegan flower children. The oldest fossil record in the Apoidea superfamily is from the Cretaceous, about 87 million years ago, while the newest was just 2 million years ago. They have been evolving for a very long time. Now, bees vary in behavior, color, size, shape, as we see, size and shape. This is the largest carpenter bee next to the smallest lost bee, named Perdita. In Grimaldi and Engel's photo, there's a representative diversity of bees. The Apoidea superfamily tree has 7 families worldwide, and 6 families live in North America. From the bottom up, we see the hairy, colorful Apidae family. On the right, the big-jawed or big-mandibled Megachilidae. Up at the top, the metallic jet-setters, the Halictidae. In the middle, we have our cranberry-shaking Melitidae and Andrenidae above that. And last, Coletidae, and we'll see all about their engineering feats. The apids and the megachilids have relatively long tongues to feed from deep or shallow corolla. The halictids, andrenids, coletids, and melitids are mostly short-tongued, feeding only from short corollas, or just climbing into the flowers if they're small enough. Now, every family has cuckoos, and I'm talking about bees here, except the Andrenidae. Top right is our Texas native, Nomada texana, in the Apidae family. About 15% of species global-wide are cuckoos. They're called kleptoparasites. For example, Nomada texana cuckoo bees mimic the odor of Andrena, their bee host, and the female lays her eggs in her host's nest. Yeah, and her larva eats the host's provisions. Now, some species, the larva even eats the host's larva. So those would be omnivores, right? Those omnivores harken back to their wasp ancestors. We said there were 6 bee families in North America. In North America, there's about 5,000 species of native bees. Just in the US, 4,000 species. And in Texas, Dr. John Neff has documented 1,000 species of native bees. Central Texas, Travis County has 300. So let's take a vote, yay or nay. Who agrees with this statement? Texas is a bee biodiversity hotspot. Yay? Yay. We all agree that native bee hotspots, that's Texas. We have 1/4 of the diversity of the United States. We do. Across our 12 ecoregions of diverse flora with about 5,000 plant species, and just in the hill country, about 2,000 species, we have a spectacular diversity of spring and fall blooms that feed bees. Does anybody know what plants feed bees during our hot, long, dry summers? Damn yellow comps. It's those damn yellow comps that keeps them going. Life history, bear with me, you'll understand why this is important. Native bee lifespans are as ephemeral as bloom seasons. While populations might last 2 to 3 months, a single adult would live 3 to 8 weeks. So a population of honeybees, and that's tens of thousands of honeybees, would last a year, but an adult lasts 8 weeks. A population of about 100 bumblebees would last 3 months, but the adult would last a couple weeks less than the honeybees. And a population of a dozen carpenter bees lasts about 2.5 months, with the adults living 3 weeks less than honeybees do. Bee lifespans often encompass lepidopteran lifespans. Their life cycles co-evolved with plants in native landscapes. So native bee foraging periods largely coincide with native blooming periods. Foraging seasons are synced with flowering phenology in general. Bees complete metamorphosis with a 4-stage life cycle, just like butterflies and moths. And compared with other insects, they consistently develop within a 4 to 6 week period in the nest, based on internal clocks and environmental cues. This minor bee's egg might hatch in 2 weeks. The larva would develop in 4 weeks and eats through the provisions that mom stocked in precise amounts. The pupa would morph into an adult and can remain dormant through winter and droughts. And the adult finally chews through the plug and digs upward, emerging in the spring. Many andrenid bees are spring bees. So you can see here, bees spend most of their life 3 to 4 months in the nest, and only 3 to 8 weeks as an adult foraging and mating. Do you see the pollen ball, that glistening orange thing? That's a bee loaf. So this andrenid minor bee collects pollen, mixes with nectar, packs it into a loaf and into her nest, where she lays an egg in precise amounts for that larvae to eat through, unless a kleptoparasite comes by. So here we can see that the life cycle in a different cavity nest. In the bee world, who determines egg sex sequence? Any guesses? Females. After mating, a female can compartmentalize sperm until she lays eggs. She lays fertilized eggs who will become females at the back or the bottom of her nest. And she lays non-fertilized eggs who will become males at the front or the top of her nest. So males emerge first, right? And they go out and feed on flowers or sleep in them and wait to mate. Now, in the bee world, who makes and provisions nests? Females. In this slide, sexual dimorphism is evident in these green sweat bees. Can you tell me which one is the female? Can we have a raise of hands? It's the top one. It's the gal with the hairy legs. That's how she carries her pollen to her brood. Males have hair. They just don't have scopa or curbicula. Although this guy does have wool stripes and green eyes. And just like peacocks, right? The fancy colors. In the bee world, who exhibits nesting behavior that characterizes sociality? Females. The bee world is a matriarchy. I insist, we have so much to learn from bees. Sociality is a species characteristic that runs the gamut from solitary to social. And it's sometimes variable in about 50 species in North America that are solitary in some environmental conditions, but semi-social in others. Social apis honeybees are an exception in the bee world, whereas native bees can have social, communal, or solitary nesting. So sociality is based on nesting. Either Western honeybees or Eastern honeybees, apis honeybees, form huge perennial colonies with casts that have reproductive division of labor. So a queen can lay thousands of eggs of infertile daughters, and overlapping generations of sister workers forage to continuously provision larvae with this nutritious fluid. This is called progressive provisioning. Colonial honeybees are an exception to the bee world. American bumblebee serves as an example of primitively social bees, small annual colonies with incipient division of labor, but no reproductive differences. A queen can find an empty mouse hole or just under the thatch of grass on the ground, make wax pots and lay 6 female eggs and forage, and then lay more eggs, repurposing empty egg cases. So she provides continuously until she has 3 overlapping generations of workers, about 50 or 100 sister bees, who cooperate to rear the next brood. By the 3rd generation, they rear the new summer queen, who lays female. So we've spoken about diet, right? We've spoken about nesting, sociality. And I'd like to ask you again, who determines the sex of eggs? Who forages for nesting? And who determines sociality? It is a matriarchy. And it turns out that in solitary bees, females live less than males. And in colonial bees, it's the opposite. Workers, like all of those colonial workers, will be outlived by drones. Curious. So the queen bumblebees, the new bumblebee that was created by the 3rd generation of daughters, goes out and founds new colonies and makes new nests, finding another abandoned hole, overwinters and dies within a year. So we're looking at a grass shoot that's cut, and these little yellow-faced bees called Hylaeus in the Coletidae family can form these cavity nests. They can go in there and line the nest with their tongues. They have secretions and they line the nest, and then they make little chambers for individual nests. So we talked about honeybees being eusocial or truly social bees, bumblebees being primitively social, so they don't have the functional castes with division of sexual labor. And these are colonial. These are communal. So they can live together, nest together, but individually take care of their own brood. So they've got a common entrance like a condo, but they've got separate apartments where they have their own brood. And those are communal bees, mutually tolerant females that share a nest, but rear their young singly. And so here I'm going to get ahead of myself. you'll see the importance of leaving grass thatch and stems and all the stuff that we're supposed to clean up in homeowners associations, suburbs, because cavity nesting bees need those little tiny stems. And I'll get into nesting substrates. We talked about different nesting socialities, which are defined by species, but carried out by female bees, moms. And we talked about social or truly social honeybees, primitively social bumblebees, and these little hylaeus that are communal bees. There's 4 families in the family of 7 bees that are communal bees. And some of them are our little sweat bees. Many species of sweat bees are communal ground nesters. And finally, I'll talk about the bees that nest singly. So single nesting bees are the most common bees among the native bees. 90% of bees are single nesting bees. And if you remember me talking about the lifespans, how honeybees, who are truly colonial, have longer lifespans. So the individuals have longer lifespans. And of course, overlapping lifespans of individuals makes the population a longer population lifespan. And they live in perennial colonies, cavity nesting colonies, or cavity colonies. Bumblebees have fairly long lifespans within the bee world, but much shorter than the truly colonial. We talked about the social bees, the primitively social bees, and these communal bees. I like to say that native bees are the hippies because they're flower children and they live in communes. And then we have the solitary bees. A single female makes and mass provisions her nest. 90% of bee species in North America are solitary nesters. For example, this mining bee is a ground nesting solitary nester. So say after 40 foraging trips to visit 2,000 flowers, mom packs that nectar and pollen into a little bee loaf and lays 1 egg on top of a bee loaf. And then she seals the chamber. She doesn't return. That is called mass provisioning. And that's what most native bees do. So the provisions that mom gathers in her lifetime for her 20 or 30 babes will be next year's local population of her species. So a bee's progeny depends on the food resources that a single female can gather in one blooming season. And that's most of our bees. Nest substrates we can categorize into 2 big, broad categories: ground nesters and cavity nesters. Nest substrates are fairly constant within species. Cavity nesters are about 25% of the species are cavity nesters in North America, such as the little mason bees, top left, babettes, the middle bees that are the same genus, Osmia, in the Megachilidae family, and she makes communal chambers in twigs. She's a twig nester. The small carpenter bees, lower right, left, Seratina, uses plant fibers within the stem pith to make like little particle board divisions. Doesn't that look like a grass stem or maybe a sunflower stem? The stubble. The large carpenter bees will drill cavities in soft wood, or she'll use last year's empty nest that mom made, or she'll just use a beetle burrow or whatever. And then there's bees like these andrenids that will use empty snail shells. Single cavity nests are like a line of condos with 1 exit. Bees separate incubation chambers and plug their nest to waterproof it, to stabilize its environment, and to prevent the spread of disease. So at the top, you can see that a large carpenter drilled a hole in the wood, and she drilled against the grain, right? But then she made a 90-degree turn to drill with the grain. And large leafcutter bees made little cigars out of leaves or leaf petals, and that's what they line their cavity with and make the divisions with. It's also how they make the plugs. Below, you see a plasterer bee that divided chambers with waxy resins, which she collects from plants. So it's a resin mastic. And mason bees make masonry walls with mud that they bring back to their nest. So look at what these bees are using for building material. Plants, mud. Ground nesters. 75% of native bee species are ground nesters in North America. And they prefer loose soil in grasslands and prairies. This striped, ooh, it worked. This striped sweat bee, Halictus, you can see top and bottom, is digging her burrow head first, as they would have to. And the andrenid over here is secreting mucilage to stabilize the walls of her tunnel. Most of them have to dig in sort of moist soil or else have secretions to moisten it. Underground nests. So bees dig vertical shafts between 6 and 18 inches deep. They smooth the walls with their abdomen and coat it with separate the chambers with this gooey secretion. They apply that with their tongue. What else are they going to use? Alkali bees can nest in the hundreds on sloped alkaline soil, and they'll lay their eggs on bee bread. But cellophane bees stick their eggs onto the wall, dangling over liquid food. So we said about 6 to 18 inches deep, right? What happens if I rototill my garden like really frequently? Yeah. And what happens when I plop down and pack down 4 inches of mulch everywhere? North American semi-arid regions have the greatest diversity of bees. How come? Because they're mostly ground nesters. And let's see if this works. If not, I'll need your help. This hairy-legged sunflower bee is going to give us a demo of how hard they work. Don't you want to hug her? So what happens if I pour 4 inches of mulch or an inch of gravel and pack it down? And you get the idea, right? Most are ground nesting bees. So we've talked about diet, nesting, and sociality. You may look at this photo, but I'd like you to close your eyes and listen to the following phrases and think about their significance. Cellophane bees are solitary ground nesters. Large carpenter bees are solitary cavity nesters. Bumblebees are social ground nesting generalists. Squash bees are solitary ground nesting specialists. Do you see that each one of those species has a resume? They have a whole bio in one phrase. It's like this nugget of ecological information about each species, which you now understand. So we speak econo about sociality, nesting, and diet. This eastern carpenter bee was squeezing out the last pollen grains of bluebonnets at the end of the season, these tattered bluebonnets. Bees do have limiting factors. In the Jaw Lab, they've researched and confirmed that there are 2 limiting factors. Basically, floral cover limits foraging. No flowers, no food. Impervious cover limits nesting and dispersal. Remember the mulch and the gravel and so on? And we know from literature, from studies that have been done across the United States and studies that are being done in Texas, that bee populations have been declining for decades, steadily, quickly. And that is due basically to 4 factors. The primary one is habitat loss due to land use change, basically from agriculture, and that's intensification of agriculture, which creates erosion, compaction, and a series of cascading effects. Fragmentation due to urbanization, which Central Texans know all too much about. And degradation due to the loss of native plants and the introduction of invasive plant species, which increases the competition for food and nesting resources. Also, insecticides, the indiscriminate use of insecticides. And that's not just from ag fields, not just from agriculture, but more and more from residential lawns. Disease, that's not just the ectoparasites like mites, but a lot of endoparasites that are spread from introduced bees and transmitted on flowers. And climate change. Global warming changes the phenology. So there's phenology shifts. And what happens? There's a desynchronization between the foraging and the flowering. Yes, bees are in trouble. And yes, a lot of the cause is us. But we're also the solution. Now, changing gears, I'd like you to explain to yourself in silence, what is this bee doing? Some say it is robbing nectar because it's going at the base of the flower, not at the top, so it's not pollinating. Others would say she is quenching her thirst and refueling. The bee is drinking nectar, right? And nectar is part of her diet. And our diets depend on their diets. Fully documented. Likewise, bees pollinate plants, whether we view pollination as an ecosystem service or as a gift of nature. There are monetary estimates that natural resource scientists can use now. And there are monetary estimates of pollination services. And they can now help one decide whether to add more wildflowers or subtract insecticides on a farm. However, bee populations are continuing their steep decline, no matter if we consider them pollination services or gifts of nature. That's the fact. But whatever camp we're in, we have the same goals: to help bees. So I ask you, how can we reciprocate the valuable gift of bee pollination? I propose that we care for their habitat now. How are we going to do that? Let's organize. Okay. One thing. What do all bees need? Actually, what do all insects? Now, wait. What do all animals need? What 3 things do we all need? Shelter, food, water, I heard. Space. Does anybody sleep around here? I know I don't sleep. Rest. Okay. Food, nest, and rest. That's it. That's what they need. Food, nest, and rest. We could certainly reciprocate by providing them resources for food, nest, and rest, couldn't we? And what is our multi-purpose tool, Native Plant Society of Texas? What are we going to provide food, nest, and rest with? Native plants of Texas. Yeah. Food resources Preferably use locally adapted native plants from your ecoregion. And we need to supplement the hill country spring and fall beautiful blooms with what? Damn yellow comps. We need to plant or conserve or provide at least 3 wildflower species native to your ecoregion, at least 1 milkweed, and bunch grasses. Remember, skipper butterflies, mestre butterflies, they nectar from grasses. Turns out honeybees take pollen from small native bunch grasses. I've seen it with my own eyes. Nest resources. Well, ground nesters need exposed, uncompacted, loose soil. And what gives them that space? The spaces between bunch grasses and wildflowers. Now, wood berms mitigate soil erosion, which is good for my native plants. And it turns out it's also good for my native bees. And I discovered something else on my land, that these wood berms do double duty. They also serve as a habitat for cavity nesters. Carpenter bees are taking over my wood berms. So save the soil and provide cavity nesting resources. And don't forget the grass thatch. Leafcutter bees, that's how they make their plugs. And rest resources. We said food, nest, and rest. Those big floppy flowers, the morning glories, poppies, nightshades, and cacti. Well, females they rest inside their nests, but males snooze in flowers. Like this longhorn bee is snoozing in a squash flower. I know you want to hug him. So native bees thrive in native landscapes. Studies report that conserving native plant habitat is easier and cheaper than restoring it. Exotic plants can invade habitat and compete with natives. So what if we mimic native landscapes in composition and structure and manage habitat for bees to conserve for other insect pollinators? And what would we use for that? Ecoregional pollinator plants, native plants. 2 ecosystems. Hill country of Texas is a mosaic of grasslands and conifer hardwood forests. Native bees have been documented taking pollen from oaks and maples. They also nest in forest soils and in snags and other resources in forests. Oaks are host to disproportionate numbers of lepidopteran larvae. Ash juniper hosts juniper hairstreak butterflies. And the juniper oak canopies have understory shrubs that provide for pollinators. Juniper duff mitigates soil erosion, which is good for our native plants and our native bees. Native prairies, that's the other part of the savanna. The hill country savannas have thousands of native plants and hundreds of native bees. So if we mimic native prairie structure and functions with native prairie plants, we will provide habitat. And we could do this along fence lines, roadsides, abandoned pastures, or enriching existing grasslands. But we do not recommend that you cut down juniper woodlands to make pollinator habitat or pocket prairies. So let's mimic a prairie landscape. Plant large patches, large blocks, or 20-foot strips of the same species to attract by color and aroma. Mix perennials and annuals of all habits, trees, shrubs, vines, forbs, grasses. Stagger your plantings for sequential blooming from spring, summer, and fall to cover all seasons. And build a scaffold on asters, sages, and legumes, and include at least 1 milkweed and bunch grasses that are native to your ecoregion. Use low or no mulch, as Xerces Society says, save the leaves or leave the leaves. and low to no insecticides. Now, diversity is key and abundance is crucial. I've made a cheat sheet for people based on the central to north Texas prairies that the JAW Lab has done research on. And this is a double pager, which you can find on our Landowners and Naturalists website. So this is a short list of native plant prairies based on research data. It's the spring and summer field data. And it lists the top 10 families with the 5 most common species per family that native bees were netted on. These are native bee prairie plants. I based it on species abundance, that's plant species and bee species. It's not a preference study. Notice who's at the top. Damn yellow comps, Asteraceae, followed by Lamiaceae, followed by Fabaceae. And that's why we recommend using that triad as a scaffold to build upon, and then add diversity and abundance, which are key and crucial. Also, the Wildflower Center and the Xerces Society collaborated to make this special value to native bees page, which lists about 1,442 results that might be quite daunting unless you really know your ecoregion's flora. That's why I made that cheat sheet, because it can be an entrance, a roadmap, a gateway for this. Dr. Shalini Jha collaborated with Texas Parks and Wildlife biologists to write a booklet on management recommendations for native insect pollinators. And basically it's based on best management practices, guidelines for native pollinators focused on, guess what? Native bees. And the rundown for native prairie, use 9 native plant species over 3 seasons to span the whole foraging seasons and life cycles. 3 in spring, 3 in summer, and 3 in fall to start with, just to build upon. I've also produced within the outreach program a series of illustrated species list, about 50 of them, for the 50 sites that have been researched by Shalini Jha and her grad students. And you can find those also on our Landowners and Naturalists website, and tips on bee habitat and a leaflet on bee conservation, and a series of other things for landowners and naturalists. Now, I'd like to say a note about bee hotels. I don't know if Jen Hrobar is in the audience. If she is, raise your hand. Not yet, I can't see. Anyway, Jen Hrobar works with landscape services at UT, and she keeps a bee hotel at the UT Orchard. And Nick Ivers, one of Shalini's students, and myself, we looked at hotel occupancy, and we found 3 species of native wasps and 4 species of native bees, including this horsefly-like carpenter bee, 2 leafcutter bees, and Babette, who was sharing a little tube with that little wasp above her. So this surprised me because literature reports that mostly bee hotels harbor non-native wasps, and then non-native bees, and mites and spiders, and a few native bees. So they're not recommended as a conservation tool. But boy, are they fun as an educational tool. So I ask you, since we've been using the biomimicry principle for landscapes, how would we build a better bee hotel? Okay, how do bees measure length, volume, distance? You know they have to do it because they measure their chamber size, and they measure the amount of, or the volume of bee bread, and they have a certain nest spacing. So how do they do it? What is their measuring stick? The body length. Ooh, you guys are good. So let's mimic gregarious solitary bee nests. And some bees, solitary bees, but very gregarious, They can nest in villages with 200 nests per square yard. Now look at those two photos. I studied them closely and I estimated, based on the body's length of each one of those species, that they're about 2 to 3 body lengths apart. So why not just copy bees who have been doing this for 2 million years to design a better bee house? Anyway, another pandemic project. I was laying on my belly long hours when I discovered I was gifted these commercial bee houses, and I said, no, those don't work, and they're not until I saw a leafcutter bee going in and out, and I spent, I don't know, weeks on my belly photographing. And you can see a blog that Nicole Elmer and myself wrote at the Biodiversity UTexas.edu website on leafcutter bee nests. And she is a master, just a masterpiece builder. You can see how she chews out the inside of the bamboo shoot and tucks in leaves, and then how she tops it off. It's fabulous. I shared this with a biologist friend of mine, and he said, well, all I see is her bee, you know, her behind, her butt. And I said, I know, isn't that cool? More bee butts. I hope that I have given you tools and inspiration to take care of bee habitat and make better bee hotels. And if you run into trouble or need more inspiration, contact me. Thanks.